Oh no. We have problem. You are. So small. Of course. I just think right now. Of course. All right. What's interesting is this. We're sitting around hanging. We're getting Hey, Jim. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Now, I was talking to Laura this morning and you weren't getting my emails on the link.
Yeah.
So we're gonna,
Thanks.
so I think we may have fixed it. I think it was just going to junk email or something along those lines. They weren't showing up. So we'll see how today goes.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we have a top secret system that excludes all the important ones unless the other ones come through. So that's the problem.
That's nice.
How are you doing? How are you doing?
Doing okay, doing okay. I just got off of a good holiday.
Good.
You know, we spent in the first part of November a week in Cabo San Lucas, which was very nice.
Nice.
Everybody masked up. And the funny thing is I spent the next week in Miami and nobody masked up
Yeah.
outside of the airport. And I'll
Right.
tell you something, you know, I was never so happy to get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
And I flew back to Houston and I picked up my daughter who was finishing up an internship there. And then once again, nobody was wearing masks until we hit the New Mexico border because we drove back. And right then and there, people started masking up. And you know, I had my booster shot yesterday. No, booster shot was on Monday morning.
Yeah.
No problems, no issues, no whatever.
You know, I try to, I mean, anybody who claims a right based on a sense of liberty is somebody that I can identify with. But on this one, because of my own vulnerability,
Yeah.
I'm in that compromised immunity group. I just don't get how they think. I really have a hard time understanding it because the statistics are there in those states that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
They're dropping like flies. I mean, and they still evidently don't get it.
Well, I think out of all the hills to fight and die on, this one makes the least sense to me. I
Yeah,
mean, my mom would tell me that and she is since her third husband, who she's since divorced, he's since passed on, but she's become this Fox News acolyte. And remember, I walked into the polling booth or the voting booth with her in 1972 and she voted for McGovern. So there's been a big, switch from one side to the next.
Yep.
You know, just today there was another evangelical who had a big media outlet who passed away because he said, he's telling that this is some sort of conspiracy. Don't take the vaccine. I'm thinking, I don't want to die of something stupid. If I'm on the plane and it's going down, there's nothing I can do.
Yep.
But if I'm able to do a few things to make sure that I'm in good shape, that's the easiest thing I could do.
Yep.
I will never understand this. I don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't. And
it's hard to, because I think of myself as someone who's been around the country. I've been in a lot of states. I've known people in all the different states. I respect a lot of people out there. I just can't get around this, that they are keeping it alive, number one, and they're endangering people around them in every direction. And I just don't understand that.
I don't get it. I mean, especially now with Omicron or whatever this is, and I don't think we know the full details yet for at least another week or two of how the vaccines work with it, but it's no, but I mean,
I watch the numbers in the Chronicle every morning, and it's a kind of a ghoulish thing to do, but the number of cases, like this morning, there were 250 cases approximately in the Bay Area and 6 deaths yesterday.
Yeah.
That's here, which is considered pretty good. So it's a real thing that's happening, and somehow we've lost our grip on real things.
The thing that's interesting to me is this. This really is what we're seeing now is a pandemic among the unvaccinated. The people who are in the hospital, I think it's 93% of them are unvaccinated. People who are on ICUs, people who are on ventilators, they all tend to be unvaccinated. Now, some of them, there may be legitimate reasons why they can't take a vaccination for whatever reason. But the reality is, if you're not doing it, you're asking for trouble.
Yeah.
And that's the part I just don't understand. I'll never get it. I don't understand it. I'm sitting there thinking, and I've had this conversation with my own sister who's in the Atlanta area. It's Audrey. Now my sister Karen and I, we are fully vaxxed and boosted up. And my wife goes in on Friday. My daughter goes in after finals. But I will not be able to convince her.
Yeah.
Owning the libs is not a good strategy when your life's on the line, and that's the concern here.
We've been very lucky. Our family has my grandson and his wife did get the virus, but it wasn't too bad. It was like a bad cold for them. My daughter had it for a while, but they were okay. So we got through it okay. Have you been reading any good books these days?
Well, actually, I haven't had a chance. There's a stack of books that I've got to read. But here's some good news. We had a luncheon with Haley Mills, the actress.
Yeah. And
I'll tell you something. There's a friend of mine, Bert Dykesler, who's in Los Angeles. He was at Prescott Rose. He's I'm trying to think where he is now, but he's a big entertainment lawyer. We see him now and then.
Yeah.
And together, the two of us helped get Haley Mills her Academy Award that had been stolen from her house. And the only reason why I knew this, and I think that it may have been one of those things where there were several people. We did our part. I know that the Academy might have done their thing. Was that I had almost broken an Academy Award years ago. There's a guy named Jeremy Larner who wrote a movie called The Candidate, in which he won the best.
I remember the
award
movie.
for.
Yeah.
It was a Redford film. Well, I had the Academy Award in my hands, and I was doing what anybody does when they have an Academy Award in their hands. They do a speech. It slipped. I caught it, and for a moment I thought, oh God, and what would have happened had I destroyed his Academy Award? And he said, well, we broke it before, the Academy will replace it. So years later, like in the movies, Bert Schneider's son, Jeff, Bert Schneider won an Academy Award for Hearts and Minds, lost his Academy Award in a fire at his house, and he had since passed away. And I knew Sid Ganis, who used to be the chairman of the Academy. He was a producer in Los Angeles. And we found out that he couldn't get it replaced because he had already passed away. But I figured out that he should be able to do it with a kid. So who knows? That's my good deed of the day. Apparently she had lost it 25 years ago.
Yeah, that's great.
Oh, where is it? I hope we are. This might be a train wreck here today because of the problems with the emails. And I think I've solved it, but I think I may have solved it too late. But Michael Resendiz will be on the call, and he was. And you saw the movie Spotlight.
Yeah.
He was He was played by Mark Ruffalo. Right. Yeah. Ruffalo.
Yeah. You get wonderful people at these things. It's fantastic.
Well, I still can't believe when we had Marvin Kalb a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, that wasn't that. Well, he was there twice.
Yeah, I mean, we had. I think we had Kalb, we had Hart, Dukakis, Jonathan Alder. We had who else? We had all sorts of folks.
I'm a little disappointed you didn't have the Pope.
I'm working on it.
I assume you're working on it.
Oh dear, oh dear. Oh, but let's see who else will be here. It's a pretty good crew,
Yeah,
usually is. And then we'll start with Dukakis next year, and he's looking pretty good. He's got to be 80, 88,
yeah.
born in 33.
Oh, he's well spoken as he always was.
Yeah.
Um, I drove cab in Brookline Village with his brother. And Michael was in the law school when we got there. I think might have been 1 year ahead of us.
He was talking about having Scalia as a classmate.
He also, his wife, who I have talked to, her father was with the Boston Symphony.
Right.
My dad worked there on the business side for 46 years. So we kind of knew Michael, and certainly knew him when he ran for president.
Yeah.
And nice man, good guy.
Well, I'll tell you, they've lived at the same house in Perry Street, and apparently they moved next. It's a duplex. It's like one of these big duplexes. So they moved next door about 40 years ago, and he said, "I'm not moving again. Not going to do it." No, 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 no. Oh gosh. But you know, and we see. The last time I was in Boston, haven't been in Boston in a long time. So I had dinner with Ben Bradley and Steve Schlesinger. No, not Steve Schlesinger. It was his brother, whose names escape me at the moment. And but I'm concerned that people have not been getting some of these emails, and so we'll see how this all works out. Neville, how you doing?
As we say in Southern California, I am totally bitching.
There you go. I miss Southern California. We used to live in Redondo as well as Manhattan Beach, and there's just something wonderful about just listening to the water lap, because we were out off of Highland in Manhattan Beach, and we would just listen to the water from our house lap into the beach, and it's just.
All right, point of note for you, Trevor McShane is my stage name as a musician.
I did not know that. Now, see, I learned something. I
lead a rock and roll band, and I have a lot of music out.
Wow. One thing I can't do, I cannot sing, I cannot dance, I cannot carry a tune, I cannot carry anything. I can just appreciate. What do you play?
I'm rhythm guitar, I'm the lead singer, and I write or co-write the songs.
Wow.
I've been doing it for 25 years. All my musicians are pros.
Wow.
If you go on YouTube for Trevor McShane, you'll see a lot of videos.
Okay. Now. So you have your Bruce Wayne existence, and then you have your Batman existence, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Mike, how are you?
Hey, I'm pretty good. Good to see you.
Good. This is gonna be interesting because I was gonna reach out I think a lot of folks were having problems getting the link for the gathering.
Huh.
So who knows how big this will be.
Sure.
But I'll tell you what we do, and it's all a lot of fun. We do this about, I don't know, 17, 18 times a year. This is our 26th season.
Wow.
We used to meet in, but before we went online because of the pandemic, we met in Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York. We would usually be in Midtown Manhattan, and Boston. We would be in we'd be in Cambridge, usually at the Toscana or something like that. And so now that we're online, it's actually a lot easier. And then, but what we're going to do is we're going to have some just gatherings next year. We do start off every year with your former governor.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, we've started off. We've started off with Dukakis now for the last, we've been around 26 seasons, I think 25 or 24 of the seasons we started with Mike.
Wow, that's something. Well, I'm in New York now, but just
you are?
FYI. Yeah, I'm in Manhattan. I'm on the Upper West Side here. I've been here for a couple of years now.
Oh, good, good, good. Because usually, I mean, I got to figure out how we're going to do this in terms of making sure, in terms of regaining some of the in-person stuff that we used to have that we don't have now, and
Sure.
mimic this. I mean, the conversation that we had with Marvin Cobb was great because we could push the conversation around to a variety of people, to Gary Hart or to Dukakis or to Jonathan Alter or to whomever. And that made for something that we would not have been able to do because nobody.
She's only got 9 people on the call,
Hello.
and let's see how many people are not. That's just everybody
Oh,
right here.
you did.
Hold on a second. We got some
Um,
folks. I'm hearing somebody. There we go. And so we'll wait a little bit here for everybody. John, how you doing today?
Hi, Bob. How are you?
Who knows how this is going to be, because we've had some issues with getting the link out to everybody. We got a number of notes saying, I can't find the link. I can't find the link. I think I've sent you the link 3 or 4 times. So there might have been an issue surrounding just the the technological piece here. So we'll just wing it.
No problem.
That's good. So we'll wait a few minutes for everybody to come on, and we'll just jump into it. We'll obviously record this so that John can use it, and we'll throw this up on the website. What's coming up? Lots of stuff is coming up. I know at some point we're going to have George Carol Oates again, Stropha Dukakis again. We'll have there's a bunch of stuff that we're working. We're trying to do more film stuff, and the reason is because that's why we originally moved or expanded to Los Angeles in the first place, was because of film stuff. And I think the craziest film one we had, I think Carrie was there, was we had Roger Ebert. This was right after the 2006 Academy Awards. And it was 48 hours after that. It was at Michael's, which is in Santa Monica, which is basically staffed by aspiring actresses, aspiring actors. It's like almost out of the movies. And so it was an evening event. It was a dinner because we had it at, after an event they had at Barnes & Noble on, I think in 4th Street or something. So we walked across and we closed what was supposed to be a 2-hour dinner. We ended up closing the place down at 2 o'clock in the morning. Ebert had to be on a flight that left at 6 for Chicago. I had to be on a flight that left at 6 o'clock for San Jose, but needless to say, it was well worth it. And the funniest thing was, and I thought this never happened in real life, but it was happening, is that you would have as they were plating the desserts, they were putting headshots under the dessert plate, or a screenplay treatment under a dessert plate. I was sitting next to Larry Terman, who's a producer in Los Angeles. Now, see, John knows who he is. He's the greatest guy. And you're on mute too. And he's done a few movies like The Graduate. And we actually kind of tap dance a little bit here. We actually did a luncheon for the 50th anniversary of The Graduate. And Larry comes from time to time. And I think he was at the Stark program at USC. And he had this great thing because the studio wanted them to have Robert Redford portray, the Benjamin Braddock or what became the Dustin Hoffman role. And it was Larry and it was Mike Nichols. They sat him down and they said, Bob, I guess they called him Bob, tell me what it's like. How do you feel when you've struck out with a girl? And the answer, and Redford had a quizzical look on his face and said, I wouldn't know. It's such a great story. But I mean, the Hollywood stuff we've done, obviously we did Ebert, we did Peter Bart on reportage, and we did Larry Kazan on directing. We've done it all. I mean, we look at things from the agency side, the actor side, and it's just all sorts of fun. So why don't we just jump into this? We're gonna have a bunch of people join us here. We're a little light but they will come on. And so this will be more collegial. It's great to have John here today. The book From Warsaw with Love is just amazing. It's a great, amazing read. You know, so often we see how spy agencies work through the lens of film. We expect everybody to be like, behave as if they are in a James Bond film. They either work for MI6 or they work for one of the competing agencies. Yet when we delve into it, it's a lot more different. And it's even more interesting once the Cold War came to an end, and there was a shuffling of new alliances. You know, the reunification of Germany, the guarantee of Poland's western border, and now we find ourselves into the 1990s and beyond. And then a very curious relationship emerges between the Americans and the Polish. And I'm going to let John take it from there, tee it up for 5 minutes. As more people will come in, we'll just kind of we'll enter them in, and we'll just go to Q&A and have fun. Take it away, John.
Thanks, Bob. It's great to be here. I really appreciate it. So I would like to talk a little bit about the backstory to how I stumbled onto this tale. In 1994, I was based in Eastern Europe, and most of my job was covering war-torn Sarajevo. I was there for the Washington Post. But in sort of the legacy of the past, the Post had its Eastern European bureau in Warsaw back, because at a period of time, Warsaw had been sort of the crucible of history in Eastern Europe, solidarity, trade union movement, and martial law and all of that. And in 1994, I began to pick up these rumors that Polish intelligence had done the CIA a huge favor by saving 6 Americans from Iraq after Saddam had invaded Kuwait. And my assistant and I worked this story on every opportunity I had. Basically, I was going to Sarajevo for a couple of months, and then I'd be allowed out for a while, a few weeks in Warsaw. And we worked this story as best we could. And finally, we got confirmation from an engineer who had been involved in this amazing exfiltration of what had happened. And I wrote up the story in a long, literally facts about yay long, and I faxed it. Sort of dates us, but that's life, to the spokesperson's office of the Polish intelligence agency. And literally by that afternoon, I had been summoned down to the agency, ushered through these long hallways in this Stalinist architecture, through these big doors facing these massive desks. And behind one of the desks loomed this presence of this fellow by the name of Gromosław Czempinski, who was the head of Polish intelligence. He had my fax in his hand, and he shook it at me, and he said, "Look, you're in possession of classified information. I could have you arrested right now." And that began what's become a 30-plus year friendship with Gromosław Czempinski. We spent the next few weeks sort of haggling over what I could and couldn't use of this engineer's story, and it ultimately appeared on the front page of the Post in January of 1995. And after that, I left Poland, left the Yugoslavia, and went on to China and other things. But I always had this sense of this exfiltration, which really involved incredible spycraft on the part of the Poles, would make a kernel of an interesting story. You know, time passed, and the Polish government in 2005 took this really rightward lurch. And they began to go after the intelligence agencies in Poland and trying to purge all people who had been communists. Because the people who ran the operation in saving the 6 Americans from Iraq had been former Warsaw Pact communist officers. But that Polish government in 2005 basically hated these guys. And so they went after them. And Czempinski at the time then reached out to me and said, "You might want to consider writing a book about what we did, because we actually created an alliance with the United States, but it seems like our current government has forgotten about it." But at the time, no one in America, none of the former CIA officers who had been participants in this relationship were willing to speak with me. So time passed, and then 2015, the Polish government, basically after bouncing around between right and left wing and center, another far right wing government was elected, which continued to go after these communists, ex-communist officers, cutting their pensions. And Czempinski again reached out to me, and at that point, he gave me the names of a number of retired CIA officers who then, through interviews, allowed me to begin to tell this story of how these ex-communist officers had jumped over to our side during as the Cold War ended, decided they wanted to create an alliance with America, and were basically engaged with very willing CIA officers who knew how good these guys were, and decided we wanted to work with them and effectively created an alliance. And so that's kind of forms the background of the book. At a period of time, the CIA actually was interested in cooperating with the book. But then because the CIA has very good relations with the current far-right government in Poland, they decided not to. But luckily, at least they didn't stop their former officers to speaking with me. And so that allowed me to report out and get a lot of details for Warsaw with Love. So that's kind of the backstory of the book, but I'm happy to talk about. And as the process of writing the book went along, I became really fascinated with things like, how does a small country that desperately wants an alliance with the United States do it? Right? And how do they feel, if you will, by being treated by the Americans? I mean, what is it like for a small country in pursuing its relations with the United States? And the book shows this because at a certain point after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States went to Poland and basically said, look, you're our ally now, so you have to do things that we ask you to do them. And one of them is we want you to open a black site on your territory where we can interrogate Al-Qaeda suspects. And the Poles did. And the Poles did it with the belief, at least, that this cooperation would remain secret. And then, for understandable reasons, CIA officers were uncomfortable with what they believed to be torture, leaked it to the press, and the result was massive investigations, et cetera, et cetera. But then Poland also feels like very much that it was left holding the bag. It reminded me of something that a former station chief of the CIA in Warsaw told his Polish interlocutors in 1994, as this alliance was really blossoming. He said, look, at a certain point in our relationship, being the United States, we are going to screw you. I can guarantee that. We're not going to screw you in the way the Soviets screwed you. We're going to screw you in a particularly American way. We're going to think we're doing good by you, but ultimately we're going to hurt you. And that's something that really stuck with me as I reported the book, specifically about the whole black sites in Broglio and how the Poles dealt with that. So I'm really happy to open this up to any questions you might have about the writing of the book or anything else.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
And let's do this. We have kind of an intimate group today. Just throw your name into the chat pile so that we're not talking over each other. And I'll jump in the first, for the first one. You don't have to put your question, just throw in your name. The sense of respect for Terry Kraft. We've had Jack Devine, who ran Global Counterintelligence, join us 4 or 5 occasions now over the past 5 or 6 years. And he keeps going back to how impressed he was with what Marcus Wolf had put together in East Germany and what some of these other non-KGB, while they were part of the East Bloc, were able to put together. What was the reputation of the East Bloc countries when it came to their own indigenous intelligence organizations, and who was the good, who were the inept, and where, and how did that how did that impact things as we move closer to the end of the Cold War?
That's a great question. And the Poles were highly respected by their counterparts in the CIA. Partially because the CIA had so deeply penetrated Polish intelligence that they knew how good these guys were, which is a bit ironic, but it's the truth. Wow. One of the Polish super spies is a fellow by the name of Marian Zacharski. And Zacharski was based in Los Angeles from 77 to 81, during which time he basically stole a massive amounts of military secrets from Hughes Aircraft by suborning a senior engineer in Hughes Aircraft, befriending him, and that guy basically was in financial straits. Zacharski plied him with money. The Bill Bell, who's the name of the engineer, gave Zacharski hundreds and hundreds of pounds of American documents, including information on the early iteration of stealth technology, which was a big thing for the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Pact, to obtain. And interestingly enough, the CIA case officer who received the tip from one of his Polish sources that there was a spy robbing us blind in Los Angeles, was a fellow named John Palovich. And Palovich, in reviewing Zacharski's case file after the FBI arrested him and finally prosecuted him and sentenced him to life imprisonment, later on he was exchanged across the bridge of spies in 1985. But Palovich, looking at the case file, basically promised himself, if the opportunity came in the future he wanted to work with people like Saharsky, not against them, because he just really admired the fellow's tradecraft. Remarkable ability to cultivate human intelligence and friendships, which was something that Pavlovich was a mastermind himself.
Jill, you're up. And you're on mute.
Yeah. John, in preparing the book, did you actually ever go to the dark site in Poland and get a feel for what conditions these folks were working in?
So I went to Stare Kekutie, which was the town in which the Polish Intelligence Training Center is based. But I applied for access into the Intelligence Training Center, but was denied. Nonetheless, in talking and interviewing Poles and Americans about the site, it was a 2-story villa that had been completely refurbished, literally painted with American paint. And the United States had installed the 110 voltage system because Europe's on 220. So it was basically this little piece, this little house of America in the middle of the Polish intelligence training site.
I'm going to follow up for one second before we go to Jim. To kind of ask, what was the, I mean, you had mentioned earlier that said that there would be a difference in the way the Americans screw you versus the way the Soviets screw you. The Americans perhaps with a sense of that we're doing the right thing, kind of screwing you over. What was, when you look back at the relationship between the Eastern Bloc satellite countries and the KGB, their intelligence services specifically, was there a sense of a sense of congruity, or were they at each other's throats, so to speak?
So, like all bureaucracies, there's definitely a certain amount of bureaucratic friction between the two sides. That was inevitable. It's basically inevitable any types of massive bureaucracies. And the Soviets being the resident imperial power, there was a lot of stuff that they forced their counterparts to do in Eastern Europe. Counterparts weren't so happy with. That said, Poland was the Poland Civilian Intelligence Agency was a bit of an anomaly in that starting in the 1970s, the Communist Party of Poland really pushed the civilian intelligence, not the military intelligence. They were pretty much attached at the hip to the Soviet GRU, but they really pushed civilian intelligence to be sort of independent from the KGB. So at the Intelligence Training Center, the same center in which these Al-Qaeda suspects were interrogated, at that training center, it was set up and there were no KGB trainers there. It was basically, KGB would visit there. KGB authorities would visit the training center, but there's no one who was resident and involved in the actual training of Polish civilian intelligence officers. So Poland really wanted to create its own intelligence culture, partially because pre-war, we're talking pre-World War II, the Poles actually had a highly functional intelligence agency. In the early 20s, when the Soviet Union invaded Poland, the Poles broke the Soviet codes so that they pushed back the Soviet armies in what was called the miracle of the Vistula River. And in the 30s, the Poles actually created a mock-up of the Nazi Enigma machine, which they passed on to both the French and the British, which formed the basis of the British ultimately breaking the Nazi codes. So Poland really had this sense of itself as a country with a intelligence tradition that was separate from that of the KGB. And that created tension later on.
And with that, Jim Marazahan, you're up.
Well, thank you. It's fascinating, very interesting. I won't go into it very much, but I've had 4 cases involving CIA agents, and one of them was at the cabinet level. And I had to study who said what to whom at those meetings. And the only reason I'm mentioning it is I had the same question then that I think your book presents. And that is, who's in charge of foreign policy within our own government? And there are many cases where that question arises in South America and so forth. So I look forward to reading the book, but they might meet once a week with the president to talk about all these things. But the Secretary of State seems to me not to have the control that we would like to assume that they have over events like this when they leave Poland, which in a lot of ways, a lot of people in the United States would think we ought to be good friends with Poland. And we left them holding the bag, and those things add up. So if you could comment a little bit on that, I appreciate it.
So I think that's a great question. I think so, and specifically with reference to the black sites, that was a decision made at the presidential level. In fact, there's a vignette in the book where George W. Bush is alone with President Alexander Kwasniewski, the Polish president, after 9/11 in the Oval Office. They're about to go out for a joint press conference, and their aides had been in the room. There was a 2-hour meeting. The aides leave, and George W. Bush motions over to Kwasniewski to say, "Hey, I got a favor. I have these high-value detainees, and I need a place to park them so we can ask them questions." So this was a president-to-president sort of decision. I don't know how much, or if not, the State Department was involved in kind of creating this policy. But I also want to go back to the earlier decision in 1990 to reach out to the Poles and to begin to work with them. And that was a decision that was made at the level of the deputy director of Soviet and Central European operations for the CIA, a fellow named Paul Redman, along with a fellow named Milt Bearden, who was his boss. This was not a decision that was made at the NSA, and that decision had huge ramifications for the creation of Poland as an ally of the United States. And so I think that on one hand, the book shows that, you know, the decisions are made kind of, if you will, where they should be, albeit perhaps mistaken at the presidential level, but there's a significant amount of kind of freelancing, if you were, if you will, that helped to create this alliance with the United States between Poland and America.
You know, in Iran-Contra, Casey was one of the witnesses, although he passed away on the early side of that event. But his history was fascinating because he came out of the Second World War and created basically what became the CIA. And its power, it seems to me, is of concern. But here you say the president said it, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
John Manlius, you're up next.
Hi, John, I'm fascinated by both the macro and the micro on this, and not quite sure which way to drive, but I'm going to opt for micro. And just wonder if you have any reflections on a tradecraft level in terms of the differences, meaningful differences between the ways the different countries from different backgrounds with different cultures come at this and the effectiveness of that.
So it's interesting, I think that in the Polish case, their excellence in the 20s and the 30s involved high level, they really focused on their mathematics curriculum was just top notch. And so their signals intelligence during that period of time, they really were very good. As one American said to me, a country like Poland has to have good intelligence because if it doesn't, it ceases to exist, right? I mean, Poland is basically flat. It's an invasion route, either cavalry or tanks, it doesn't matter. But later on in the 70s and the 80s, they really succeeded because of their ability to cultivate human intelligence sources. And that was an area in the 1990s that the CIA was relatively weak at. And so they used Poland's ability to leverage its human intelligence as a way to benefit greatly the United States, particularly because in the transition between communism to capitalism, or whatever the system that Poland was transitioning to, Poland still maintained very close relations with these countries around the world that Americans couldn't travel to: North Korea, Iran, Cuba, even Iraq. And that gave the CIA, through these Polish intelligence and their use of human sources, access to a huge amount of information, including in what was then becoming the former Soviet Union. And they transitioned from an agency in the pre-war area that was very focused on signals intelligence to an agency that really excelled in the cultivation of human intelligence sources.
John, if you could give us an overview of what took place in 1990 when the Polish operative exfiltrated 6 Americans. I wish Joe Wilson would have been with us. Joe is the son of Ambassador Wilson. He's an old friend. He sends his regrets. But his father obviously was, I think, he basically shut down the Baghdad office. and left when everybody else did. But walk us through what took place and walk us through the significance of that.
So actually, I was lucky to have interviewed Joe Wilson, the former ambassador, before he passed away about this incident. And he was very, very helpful. And it's really very sad that he's gone. He was a great man and a great diplomat. So basically in October, so Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in August of 1990. And there's all these people at the Kuwaiti embassy, the US embassy in Kuwait, that need to be pulled out. And the Iraqis allow them to leave and come to Baghdad, several hundred of them. And once they arrived in Baghdad, they allowed the women and children to drive out north into Turkey, which then happens. It's sort of a 400 some odd mile drive, and it took them 24 hours. But nonetheless, they're safe. In that group of men, there's a few people that the United States government does not want to fall into Iraqi hands. And one of them is named John Feely, who's a major and part of Norman Schwarzkopf's staff. And basically the fellow who, with a team of other people, had war gamed the whole idea of what would the US do if Saddam invaded Kuwait. And in fact, CENTCOM was already doing war games on that very topic when Saddam actually invades Kuwait. And so Feely, in his head, has all the plans for how the United States is going to counter the invasion. And Wilson said to me, basically, if the Iraqis had captured him and stuck his feet in a barrel of acid, the Iraqis would know what we were going to do to remove them from Kuwait. So he needed to be saved. There was also a station chief of the CIA, a fellow named Hunter Downs, who needed to be exfiltrated. There were several National Security Agency communicators, and another US Army officer, Fred Hart, who needed to be moved out because he'd done a lot of work for the CIA as well. And so there's various scenarios. Like, should we punch out, should we do a kinetic movement out through Syria? Should we throw them down to the Jordanian border to see maybe if they can get out in all the chaos? What should we do? And then we actually began to ask our allies, the French, the Brits, and even the Russians, for help. And everyone's too busy helping their own people. And finally, people within the agency say, look, we might want to go to the polls, because the United States, previous to that, starting in March of 90, had already started speaking with the Poles. The CIA had already started speaking with the Poles about cooperating. And so we went to the Poles and we said, look, we have this operation, we'd like you to do it. Station chief at the time was a fellow named Bill Norville in Warsaw, who had absolute faith that the Poles could carry it off. Norville approaches his Polish contacts in a park in Warsaw on a kind of balmy spring-like day in late September, and said, we need your help. And the Poles literally within 24 hours said, we're going to do it. And the man who made the decision was a former Solidarity activist who'd fought against the communist regime, but with Poland's change from 89 to 90, had been placed in a position of being the head of Polish intelligence, right? He was the first Solidarity fellow to run Polish intelligence. And he basically said, we've got to do this because I need to prove to America that we are not going to be just taking handouts, but we're going to be actually a loyal ally. The communists within the former the intelligence agency were also eager to do the operation because they wanted to prove both to the Polish government, the new Polish government, which was free and liberal, and the United States, that they could shed their communist past and move on and become good partners with America. So everybody had a stake involved. And the CIA was interested because they really wanted to show the rest of the US government, because the State Department was actually kind of reluctant to help to embrace the communists. They wanted to show the rest of the US government that it was a good decision not to demand that Poland dismantle its communist system and kind of transition to a new, in its transition to a new system. And so then they send Gromosław Czempinski, this Warsaw Pact spy, into Iraq, masquerading as a second secretary in the Polish embassy. And when he lands in Iraq, suddenly Czempinski discovers that as a diplomat, he can't really move around the capital at all, much less Iraq. So he gets another identity as a Polish businessman. And there were thousands of Polish workers doing construction work in Poland. And suddenly Czempinski is not only a fake ID as a second secretary in the embassy, but also a fake ID as a Polish executive of a state-run construction company, which gives him a lot more freedom to move. Long story short, he finds the 6 Americans, dresses them up in Polish workers' overalls. Luckily, they were all white. Gives them 6 fake Polish passports with fake Polish names. And the names had been written by John Palevich and he tried to make them the easiest Polish names to pronounce, but not even the Americans couldn't even like get through those names himself. So Czapinski at a certain point is completely flabbergasted with this horrible American pronunciation, and he kind of literally douses the Americans with Johnny Walker Black, trying to kind of turn them into drunk Polish workers as he drives them out of Iraq into Turkey, which ultimately succeeds. So that's a long story short. That's kind of how he managed the exfiltration.
So who's next here? Who would like to ask a question? Because I got 4 or 5, but I want to kind of pace myself. Somebody's trying to get off mute. Help me understand the that as Poland went rightward politically, the victims of whatever persecution, loss of pension, diminishment of pensions, were in fact the old communists within the intelligence agency, who were in fact helpful to the Americans. I need to understand that a little better.
So in 1990, right, the Polish kind of solidarity government makes this decision, which was backed by the United States, not to dismantle all the bureaucracy of Polish communism. And in fact, they keep the Foreign Intelligence Bureau, basically. I mean, they start to bring in new blood, people who have been solidarity activists, people who've been involved in solidarity's secret missions, kind of setting up printing presses, et cetera, as they've pushed back against the communist regime. They bring this new blood in, but they keep the core of these foreign intelligence officers, and they don't fire them. And it's those officers who as in the case of Iraq, exfiltrate these Americans, but then they also begin to work with the United States in operations around the world, leveraging their former sources in Pyongyang, in Warsaw, in Moscow, in Tehran, in Havana, and other places that Americans couldn't go. And it becomes the exfiltration operation becomes this blood bond between the two services, and cooperation blossoms. Mm-hmm. But then over time, there's occasional like right-wing voices inside the solidarity movement who say this is a mistake, and these people who are communists should be punished and fired from our government, right? Because they serve this horrible regime that dominated us for 40 some odd years, and we have to get rid of them completely and punish them for serving the Soviet Union, right? And there was this tension in the solidarity movement or inside Polish politics about what to do. Now, the first solidarity government said we need to draw a thick line, as Prime Minister Mazowiecki said, between the past and the present and move on. Whereas the other strains in the right-wing strains in the solidarity movement are like, no, we have to punish these people. And this keeps on popping up. And so it pops up in 2005, 2006, sort of, but then the right-wing faction of the solidarity loses an election. Ex-communists are elected, they kind of run the country for a decade, but it pops back up in 2015. And then that government begins to take a series of steps to punish these ex-communists. By this time, these guys are all in their 50s and 60s, right? So they can't like go into the forest and start a counter-revolution, they're too damn old. And so their pensions are getting cut down to well below the poverty level. They're denied their medals, and sort of all sorts of steps are taken to try to punish them for their former service for the former regime. The CIA at this point is mute. They don't lobby on behalf of these guys because the CIA is so interested in maintaining current good relations with their Polish operative friends that they don't want to alienate the Polish government and cause any problem in the relationship. So all these fellows who did great work for the CIA for decades are kind of abandoned both by their Polish government, but also by the CIA, which benefited greatly from that relationship.
Wow. Who's next? John, you up? I thought you had a question. I'll just, Jim, you're up. Go for it. You're on mute.
On the question of torture, you said that the Poles did all the torture.
No, the Americans, we're talking about the black site?
Yes.
No, the Poles say that they were never allowed access to the villa.
So the Americans did the torture. Do you know of any effort, legislative or otherwise, to prevent torture in the future by the American government?
Well, I mean, there are new rules that prohibit at least waterboarding and a bunch of a group of other techniques to, these enhanced interrogation techniques that have been passed by the United States government. So John McCain was involved in writing that legislation. The problem for the Poles was that they claimed that they never actually had access to any of these sites, but nonetheless, they've been held liable for them by the European Court of Justice.
Yeah. Thank you.
Here's a question. When you look back at where the CIA had its black sites, traditionally they would be in countries where that kind of behavior was par for the course. You would have a black site in Pakistan or in country in Afghanistan or some other country that was, so let's say, away from the headlines, with the exception of Guantanamo. I need to understand what the CIA was thinking by citing a black site in a NATO ally, one where you don't have an authoritarian government in a traditional sense. Obviously, Poland's far right. They tend to drift in that authoritarian sandbox today, but it's not like it was during the days of Yaroslavsky, where you had basically a military junta running the place. What was going on here?
So that's a great question. In fact, in the Senate committee's report on the black sites, they talk about a debate within the CIA, amongst the CIA lawyers, about whether Poland would be an appropriate place to ask. And the subtext of that debate was that Poland had experience as basically a Soviet, dominated by the Soviet Union, and had a very rough experience with political police and with torture. But nonetheless, the CIA went to Poland with this ask, partially because Poland was such a staunch ally of the United States. As one director of clandestine operations for the CIA said, "You have no idea, Poland is the 51st state. Anything we asked them to do, they were willing to do." It was remarkable at the closeness that the relationship had achieved. George Tenet, former CIA director, in a letter to one of his Polish counterparts, a fellow named Bogdan Libera, basically said, "You have to understand, the CIA has the second best intelligence relationship with your country than we have with any other country around the world. The first best, of course, implication was with the UK, but the second best." That's a pretty extraordinary thing to say in basically just a decade after Poland had switched and had come over to our side of the Cold War, and things had changed there. So that's, I think, why Poland was chosen. It was considered such a loyal ally that it would do anything for the United States.
And the follow-up would be, and folks, feel free to ask a question too, would be this: did that Polish sense, Polish rapprochement, whatever you want to call it, extend itself into Romania or the Czech Republic or Slovakia, or the confederation of countries that originally was Yugoslavia or Albania, or some of these other countries, which, in case of Albania, had a hardline Stalinist state, complete with a hardline Stalinist secret police network.
So we had another black site in Romania, but it was far less important. I mean, the Polish site was by far and away the most important black site we had. I mean, this is the place where we took Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind of the 9/11 attack, to be waterboarded 183 times over the course of 2 weeks. So Poland was really number one. Upwards of 11 men were interrogated there by both the CIA, but also by contractors for the CIA.
So what does that, in terms of did that impact when it came out in the press, ripple through the relationship between not only the countries themselves, but the relationship between the intelligence services?
So the Poles understandably felt completely burned by this. and an earlier Polish government, the Donald Tusk government, which was sort of left of center, a centrist government, basically launched an investigation about it, seeing whether any laws had been committed. The whole issue about whether the Poles did or didn't have access to the villa is a huge issue, because the Poles have initially claimed that no such site existed. And then when the proof was incontrovertible, they changed their story. Both Kwasniewski and Miller, the president and the prime minister, said, okay, we did have this site, but we never saw what was going on inside it. And that's like the current level of denial, is that the site existed, but we never knew what was happening inside it. But there's a Polish criminal investigation that's gone on for more than a decade, and it's yet to be finished, about who actually was in the villa at the time. And that's actually now rising to the Supreme Court, because in the United States, because there's a case in the United States taken by the Polish, basically prompted by the Polish government, which is attempting to let the Polish investigators interrogate a former Al-Qaeda suspect, along with a CIA psychologist, about who was in the villa at the time. But this is going to rise to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will probably not accept the argument. And so these people won't be allowed to give testimony. But nonetheless, it shows that this thing is still very much an issue between the two countries. And the Poles very much feel burned by the whole experience, even though they clearly were breaking their own law as well.
Here's a question. What happens to the former intelligence apparatus of a former East Bloc country? You wonder, all the folks who were involved in, say, in East Germany working for the Stasi, who were not just informants, but who were actual uniformed members of the intelligence corps. I mean, you just can't go get a job. You just can't update your resume or whitewash it and get a job within a Western intelligence service.
Right.
And the question is, where do those people go? And the reason why I ask that is that even though they're out of power or they're out of favor, they still carry their Rolodex with them, which can contain a number of interesting folks. I mean, because you had mentioned that as the first governments that was Solidarity in the 1990s that made up the Polish government, dealt with this intelligence service that had harassed, tortured, and beat the crap out of them from 1980 until the fall of the wall.
Yeah,
you had that. So where do those guys go? I mean, and do they pop up later working for more nefarious organizations?
Well, they pop up as the head of the Russian government as well.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think there's different paths, and the Polish government basically made the decision, the Solidarity government, to vet the 30-odd thousand employees of the SB, which was the Polish security services. There was a small portion of them who were foreign intelligence. In the foreign intelligence group, there were several hundred. Only 3 of them didn't pass the vetting process, partially because they were involved in anti-Solidarity activities overseas. And the Solidarity government didn't want any anti-Solidarity characters to be in foreign intelligence. Although one of those people, who's actually a character in the book, pops up again as an agent of a Polish intelligence officer, right? He's like an asset that is being used by Polish intelligence because he's such a darn good spy. So the Poles have this vetting process in the early 1990s, where basically people who were involved in actual torture and other crimes against Polish citizens were moved out of the agency, but most of the people were offered a chance to be rehired. Other places like the Czech Republic got rid of the STB. The Czech Republic's secret agency was called the STB. That was of Czechoslovakia. They were involved in all sorts of dirty tricks around the world. They had Semtex, this plastic explosive, which could escape detection by a lot of metal detectors. So they were involved in terrorist operations. The Czech Republic basically just got rid of it completely. So all these guys were fired. A lot of them then resurfaced in privatization deals, right? Because of basically, Bob, your point that they had a pretty substantial Rolodex. And so that's just kind of one reality. In Poland as well, former spies were involved in a lot of somewhat shady, in several instances, privatization deals. And in Russia, definitely. We saw that a lot with Russian privatization. The KGB and the FSB were intimately involved in privatization deals, which enriched friends of the current president, Vladimir Putin.
Okay, who has a question? I think we have a couple of people going for their mute button. Mike, listen, I'll jump in with another one. Well, Mike, you're up.
John, what do you mean by privatization deals?
So in the transition from the communist era to the new era, there was a large number of state-run companies that needed to be privatized and turned into private firms. So in Russia, you saw that big time in the oil and gas sector. In the Czech Republic as well, all of their manufacturing was privatized. And so companies with decent technology were early marks for privatization, but also for Western investment. And in many cases, not in all of them, but in many cases, former intelligence officers, because of their Rolodex, their connections, had a piece of this action. So Gromisław Czempicki, the fellow who was involved in exfiltrating the 6 Americans from Iraq in October of 1990, he ultimately went into business as an advisor for major accounting firms and was directly involved in the privatization of Polish banks. So,
I wondered if any of them had become sort of private spies, so to speak, going to work in corporate espionage or starting their own secret companies to spy for various governments or for the corporate sector.
So interesting that you would say that. One of the fellows, a fellow named Alexander Makowski, was a heralded Warsaw Pact officer working for. He's a Pole. He was one of the 3 guys who was vetted out of the service. And he then ultimately became a freelancer, doing the very type of activity you said. He was actually involved deeply in working in Afghanistan, as trying to develop Polish business in Afghanistan, which actually he was pretty successful at. The Poles printed the Afghan currency for a while, and were involved in the mining of topaz, which Afghanistan is famous for, and lapis lazuli as well.
Interesting.
I'll jump in with a question here. Well, walk us through what the current relationship is between the FSB and the Polish intelligence services. Is there still a residue of kinship, or has that completely vanished in light of current, we'll not say Russian border threats or what do you want to call it, but is there still something there? I mean, I sense that many of the Americans kept asking their Polish counterparts, are you really our friend? Are you really our ally, or are we being had? So walk us through that if you could.
So it's interesting. You look at sort of 2 nations in Eastern Europe that have had this hard right lurch, right? One is Hungary and one is Poland. And Hungarians under Orban kind of lurched hard right, but kind of they're relatively pro-Moscow. Whereas in Poland, it's pretty much politically impossible for any political party to embrace Russia. It's just not going to happen. Partially, there's the cultural divide of Catholics versus Russian Orthodox, and partly, a huge factor is it's just history. And the Poles have been dominated, invaded, occupied by the Russians and the Germans and the Austrians and the Swedes, but by the Russians for centuries. And so that issue is, you're never going to see a government in Poland, unless it's forced to, embrace the Russians as their Slavic brothers. It's just not going to happen. That part of history is done and forgotten. Well, not forgotten, it's done and never forgotten. That said, the CIA and the Polish counterintelligence did do significant amount of work to weed out what the CIA believed to be and what Polish intelligence discovered to be significant Russian penetration, particularly in military intelligence. Because as I said, starting from the 70s, the Poles really trained their own foreign intelligence officers out without Moscow support, but their military intelligence was always very much attached at the hip with the GRU. Mm-hmm. And so there have been, up until the early 2000s, significant number of cases of finding Soviet plants inside, or Russian plants inside military intelligence. And so that's been much more of a challenge. But on the foreign intelligence side, it was pretty much a clean shop. And the CIA was comfortable with that idea because the CIA had also deeply penetrated Polish intelligence as well in the 1980s. And so there's these points that John Palovich, the CIA officer, kind of is confronting, where he's sitting across the table as a representative of the CIA to Poland, speaking with officers, Polish officers, who Palovich had had as agents just several years before that. So it was a little bit kind of incongruous for him to deal with that. He knew intimate details of these guys' lives, but he had to pretend like he'd never met them before.
Which leads us to the question. There was always this comment that Americans would betray their country for money. Members of the East Bloc would betray their country for something. I mean, are there some rules? I mean, it had to be mind-bending to sit down across the table of people who would be, in fact, foreign assets. Walk me through. I mean, what made a Polish officer or the members of the Polish security system decide to become an American asset? And I guess the follow-up on that is how did that play over into the 90s and beyond?
So
because at that time, if you became an asset, you were essentially writing your own death warrant.
So the most famous Polish spy, probably the most famous Warsaw Pact spy, is a brigadier general named Ryszard Kuklinski. And Kuklinski came over to our side. He basically began working for the United States and the CIA because he was worried, because he was part of the general staff of the Warsaw Pact. So he had access to all of the military intelligence in the Warsaw Pact, because he was, Poland's representative to the general staff. And he was shocked to learn of Soviet invasion plans of Western Europe. Not like as if the Soviets were actively planning to invade Western Europe, but what would happen if the Soviets made that invasion. And his analysis would be that the Soviets would invade because they had a conventional military superiority over NATO. They would invade the Western Europe, but while they did that, after they did that, basically they acknowledged to him that Poland would basically, as a nation, cease to exist because they would expect that it would be hit by nuclear weapons. And he was shocked that this was basically being contemplated by the Soviet Union. And so he went over to the United States. And for more than a decade, he funneled information to the CIA about this type of issue. And it was his belief that he was being profoundly patriotic. It was a love of Poland that pushed him to betray his nation. And his case became a huge case in Poland after 1989 because, the communists who were allowed to remain in Poland's military and the security services basically were saying, are you saying that all of our service for Poland was a lie, right? In trying to, turn him into a hero? Right? Is everything we've done just been in the service of another nation? Or could it not be seen that we were also patriotic as well? So his motivation clearly was to try to save Poland. Many other people came for money, of course. People were suborned by the FBI, caught in positions, compromising positions with other women who were not their wives, and that leverage were used. And also people came over to the United States because they respected the United States and they saw that our economy was more successful than their economy. At home, they were facing bare shelves, right? But in the United States, they saw a land of plenty. So I think there's many motivations and many reasons for people coming over to our side. The issue, though, is then if we burn them on such a routine basis, such as the black sites, right? At a certain point, they're going to say, we're kind of done cooperating with you, which is what I think one of the concerns that this book raises.
So I'm going to take a pause and see if anybody has a question to ask, and I'll go on and ask more questions. Anybody want to ask a question?
I will
John.
briefly, which is, you mentioned earlier that the Poles had moved away from signals into human intelligence, and interestingly done. Have we gone somewhat the other direction? And is that part of any reason for what I've been hearing, what we've been hearing recently about Russia particularly, is that we don't really have much intelligence, it sounds, inside those circles. I'm just wondering, how we're playing things.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we have the same problem in China too, that we've so reliant on signals intelligence and so reliant on technology that we've lost the capability to cultivate sources. And sources can be very, very useful. And Poland was very good at that and clearly complemented the strengths of the CIA and the NSA as well. But I think that the CIA is still kind of reeling from huge counterintelligence defeats in China and similar probably debacles in Russia, which have yet to be reported. But the Chinese debacle has been reported well in the current press.
Just to follow up on that, do we, I assume we're using allies who do have human intelligence assets and sort of focus on that still, maybe even Ukraine. I don't know if they're similar to Poland in this way, but does that's what's the alliances are really trying to fill each other's gaps at this point?
Yeah, very much so. And I think that then liaison between the services is probably the most closely held part of this sort of classified information, because what others are doing for us is always very secret, because we try to protect both methods and sources, and those are our sources. But yeah, definitely. And you see that with how much we relied on Poland for intelligence about what was happening as the USSR broke up. And then as Russia tried to kind of reassert its right to be a world power. And the Poles were providing the United States with a lot of very raw and very good intelligence on, for example, reforms within Russia's military, which looked at in 1989 and 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart as kind of a sad joke. But in the last few years has significantly improved and trying to reestablish its sway over its former empire.
Here's a quick question. Well, I mean, when you look back at Poland today, it seems it's gone to a far right, almost authoritarian direction. Same can be said for Orban in Hungary. Is that a residue from the authoritarianism that took place during the East Bloc years? Is this something cultural? Is this something, or is this something else? I mean, yes, we'd all like NATO allies to be all liberal democracies, but there was a time, quite frankly, when you had the colonels were running Greece. They still remained a vital NATO ally until democracy came back. So my question is will we, when you look back at Poland today, or we'll add Hungary to the mix, is that from a political perspective, are they going to be still out there, or are they going to move back to the center at some point?
Great question. I think you already see in Poland a push towards some more centrist type of political power. So the Law and Justice Party, which had a majority in 2015 to 2016, is now a minority party, even though its representative is the prime minister, and its president the president is also from that party. But it's a minority party now, which is staying in power because of its participation in a coalition government. And in Hungary, you see a lot of, basically the opposition is united around a candidate who is a right-wing candidate, but nonetheless, he's against Orban's party. So you see a uniting and a desire to replace Orban's political machine with a different, less populist and crazy right-wing as Orban as well. In Poland, I think that there's a lot of reasons why it swung in a far right direction, but one of them is the sense that you also see in this country of a white majority feeling as if it's being flooded, in this case, in Poland's case, by immigrants and dark people from the Middle East. And in the United States, it's from whatever woke culture or whatever, the sense that that certain white communities have in feeling threatened by the changes in America's society, by the fact that our foreign-born population has doubled since the 1970s. It was 7% in 1970. Today, it's around 14%. And people just having difficulty coping with that reality. It's a similar situation in Poland as well. And partially because of the policies of the EU, which have been somewhat befuddling in terms of, in some cases, welcoming refugees, in other cases, shutting them off. The Polish right wing has been successful at leveraging that fear of the refugee amongst the Polish voting public to get itself into power. But it's changing in Poland. In fact, like I said, the Law and Justice Party, which is the populist right-wing group, is now a minority government, and there's possibility that they actually could lose power in the next election.
How is, I mean, how is the Polish security apparatus seen internally by Polish citizens? Is it seen positively, negatively, or somewhere in the middle?
So I think it's somewhere in the middle. But I also think that, I mean, if you look at public opinion in Poland, when the black sites came out, there were some in the center and to the sort of to the left who were really shocked about the human rights issues and the torture that happened at the villa. But the general sense was less shock and more disappointment that the Americans would have leaked about this issue and hurt the alliance somehow. And that's, I think, interesting. And the sense is that the Poles as a nation will always have America's back, has maintained even past this imbroglio with the black sites. And so in the early 2000s, after 9/11, the Poles continued to spy on our behalf and undertake extremely risky missions in places, for example, like Iran, which, you know, their operatives could have been caught and shot by the Iranians easily. So they're still willing to risk their lives for us. And so I think amongst the Polish polity, if you will, there's a sense that they're still very much a loyal American ally, and they're backing what their intelligence agencies do to maintain that relationship with the United States. I mean, after all, they fought on our behalf. They fought with us in Iraq. George W. Bush's, you know, Iraq operation, they were right behind us, right? They were shocked at what we did once we toppled Saddam, but they were a loyal ally and they went into Iraq with us.
The reason why I ask, and I have to laugh about this a bit, I've collected stamps since I was a little boy, and now I still have it. But one of the things that along the Soviet stamps, they actually have a stamp commemorating, you know, Kim Philby and other members of the Cambridge Five, as if they're, you know, these great paragons of Soviet gamesmanship. I was curious how that's why I was curious how the Polish, you know, the intelligence services are perceived internally, and if they're seen as, and the other piece too, if you look, say, in Pakistan, you know, the ISI, that works maybe together or at cross purposes with the civilian government, where obviously it would be different in Poland. Who else has a question before I ask it, before I monopolize things here? Anybody going once? Okay, I'll ask another one. Where are things? What are the two top three? You know, couple things that keeps the head of the Polish security up at night?
Well, I mean, they just had this crisis with Belarus,
right?
With the border situation, and Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, using refugees as kind of a soft way of pushing at Europe. And now Ukraine and the Russian army massing on Ukraine's border, and what are Putin's intentions there? So and then further down the road, does Russia have intentions towards the Baltic states? This is Poland's neighborhood, right? And those are the three, I think, areas where they're the most concerned. And they're a member of NATO, despite their hard right government. They're a member of NATO, and so NATO is concerned with these issues as well, right? But they directly affect Poland. And in fact, in Poland, you talk about refugees, there are 2 million Ukrainians living in Poland as refugees, basically. Any Uber driver in Warsaw is going to be Ukrainian. And that's, you know, it's a population that you can't really see, because they basically, you know, after a few months, they can speak pretty darn good Polish because the languages are very similar and they blend in very easily, but they're refugees in that society. And the Poles, if Ukraine has instability, the Poles are going to get an even larger number in their country as well. And so those three issues are of direct consequence to them.
So do you think, for example, the Belarus will act as a proxy for for Russia to create a variety of, we'll call it mischief, geopolitical mischief on that front. Because, and also too, if I'm not mistaken, going back to Russia, isn't there a swath of land between, I forget which one of the Baltic nations is the most southern?
Kaliningrad.
That's actually a non-contiguous section of Russia.
Yeah, it's Kaliningrad. It's a Russian naval installation. Yeah. Yeah, a Russian fleet is based there. Yes. And it's non-contiguous. So yes, I mean, I think that, I mean, you know, from just sort of my armchair philosophizing, I think Putin's game is to sow chaos around his borders as a way to, you know, benefit himself. And Lukashenko is just a proxy for Vladimir Putin, even though personally, apparently they don't get along very well, but their interests are clearly aligned. And the Poles are very cognizant of that reality, and so they're very, very focused on trying to take steps to, you know, remediate that problem. So for the time being, it seems that the border situation has calmed down, but the next problem is going to be Ukraine. And what are Putin's intentions there? And the Poles are very focused on trying to determine those as well. And I can imagine that the cooperation between the CIA and the Polish intelligence agency on that issue is very, very close. The Poles, interestingly, after 1989, left their people, their foreign intelligence bureau people in Moscow for 6 years after. There's a fellow named Zdzisław Sadowicz, who was basically the head of the Polish intelligence in Moscow. Before 1989, he stayed for 6 years, and he was, everyone I've talked to, both in the CIA and also on the Polish side, he was a gold mine of information because, back to your point, Bob, he had a Rolodex of KGB officers on whom he could rely for good information. And that I think that understanding and that closeness in looking at Russia has been very helpful to the CIA.
Well, let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to the 80s. Let's go back to Able Archer 83. I just thought I'd raise that one. For those who aren't familiar with Able Archer 83, it was a series of very realistic Western maneuvers. There were war games on the NATO side that the Russians took as if it was a real pretext for what would be a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union and East Bloc forces. My question was, what in your conversations with your Polish intelligence contacts, were they aware of that? And were they as frightened as apparently everybody is now seeing in declassified documents, where people are saying, my God, we almost came to a nuclear exchange, which had nothing to do with any global crisis. It was a series of communication misunderstandings.
Yeah, no doubt. My sources, even though it wasn't not a focus of the book, but my sources in speaking about that, yeah, there's just a lot of potential for miscommunications when you don't talk. That said, there was significant back channel between the CIA and Polish intelligence in the 1970s and 80s, because the CIA was involved in purchasing weapons that were used in Iran-Contra from the Poles. So there was back channel, but in the case of Able Archer, obviously nobody was talking, and they should have been.
Wow. Who else has a question? Who else has a question? We have a little more of an intimate group today because of a technological stumble, but I think this is very interesting. Where do things go from here? We'll begin to wrap up, and we'll go a few more minutes, and we'll call it a day. This has been great. Where do things go from here?
So I think that my sense of one of the points of the book is to try to get at the idea that the United States is actually a powerful nation, not really in spite of our alliances, but because of them. And this book kind of shows the lengths to which these smaller countries with excellent services will go to help the behemoth that is us. At the same time, it's also kind of, as one Polish politician told me, he said, look, being an ally of America is kind of like being married to a hippopotamus. In the beginning, it's warm and cuddly, but then the hippo turns, crushes you, and doesn't even notice. And another kind of goal of mine was to try to push the idea that we need to be mindful about the the nations that befriend us and basically, keep their interests not at, as intimate as our own, but nonetheless in the backs of our minds as we pursue our foreign policy. Being more transparent and open with people who are willing to risk their lives for us is probably a good idea. But I also think going forward, you see in Poland a turn away from focusing on Washington as the primary relationship and more towards an understanding that Poland is going to succeed and fail pretty much with the European Union and not so much with the United States. Obviously, it needs good relations with Washington, but I think this whole story evidenced the fact that Poland, as a maturing country, hopefully as a maturing democracy, is probably going to have its interests more rooted in Europe than in America. The issue is how America helps that process and can help Poland along in terms of politics, but also in economics, but also obviously in intelligence as well.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a perfect place to stop. This has been great. I really enjoyed this because I'll say that I get to ask a ton of questions that I normally don't get to ask. So this has been fun, and having part of my family who escaped from Ukraine, spent time in Warsaw before they got on a ship and left for what became Rochester, New York, where I grew up. It's very interesting to see how that whole neighborhood within Eastern Europe has transformed alongside the rest of the world. And so don't everybody leave quite yet. This is a housekeeping question. We had some technological challenges on this call, not the call itself, that came from the emails. Were you guys getting the copies of the emails that I sent out earlier that had okay. So I think but you got the one I sent out this morning that was sent to you individually. So that was the cause of our problem. And I sense that we had a little bit last time because there have been some people who've called, well, I didn't get them. All right, so now we know. So I want to thank everybody for popping by. It's been fun. Go back to your days, have fun. And John, you're in Berkeley. Where are you in Berkeley?
Up in the hills.
Okay, well, I'm in the East Bay. I'm in Antioch Brentwood. So
Right.
what I can do, if you want, for the signed copies, I can just run down and we can grab lunch and.
That'd be great.
So
Looking forward to reading the book. Thank you, John.
yeah,
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I will get the book plates taken care of and the books ordered and all that other stuff.
Appreciate it.
So thank you very much, everybody. And thanks
Thank
for
you.
a great day.
Have a
Bye-bye
great
now.
day.
Bye.